Well, welcome to today's webinar, Benchmarking Progress, Examining the Effectiveness of Benchmarking and Transparency Programs. We're very happy to have three excellent presentations on some exciting new research into the effects of benchmarking and transparency policy today. We have just a brief introduction by Andrew Burr from the Department of Energy and myself, Zach Hart. I'm with the Institute for Market Transformation. Then we'll be hearing from Natalie Mims and Steve Schiller from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs on their report, Benchmarking and Transparency Programs, Attributes, Impacts, and Best Practices. Then Professor David Hsu from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology will be speaking of estimating energy savings from benchmarking policies in New York cities and for other cities. And finally, Patrick Hughes from the National Electrical Manufacturers Association on their report, Benchmarking Impact Survey, Measurement Prompts Management. And then folks, we'll have a question and answer session after the presentations, roughly 20 minutes. If you could use, since there's so many of you, we won't be having an open discussion, but you can use the chat function on your little GoToWebinar dashboard and enter your questions, and we will moderate those and field them to the presenter. So that said, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Andrew Burr from Department of Energy to say a few words. Andrew?
Thanks, Zach. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is Andrew Burr with the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. First, thanks to Zach and IMT, which is continuing to do just really nice work in this space. And just a few remarks to kick us off. The Energy Department is interested in benchmarking programs and the impacts of these programs as they've expanded nationwide in cities and states and counties, as are policymakers and researchers and many other types of organizations. The benchmarking evaluation that you're going to hear about today was actually required of DOE by the Energy Efficiency Improvement Act of 2015. It was conducted by two researchers, Natalie Mims and Steve Schiller at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and I think they did just an outstanding job with a very complex topic. So we completed this evaluation in April, and we're just really pleased to provide a summary of our findings today. And I'll speak for myself. I'm also very excited to hear more about the research by David at MIT and by Patrick at NEMA. So I'll hand it back to you, Zach.
Thank you, Andrew. So before we begin, let me just briefly tell you a little bit about Institute for Market Transformation and benchmarking policies. Is just sort of background information before we get to the presentations. Institute for Market Transformation, or IMT, as we call ourselves, is a nonprofit organization that works to promote and increase energy efficiency in buildings. Our ultimate goal is to try to get to a future where all buildings are energy efficient, and we do that by identifying solutions to promote broader adoption of energy efficiency. So we try to identify challenges preventing public and private markets from embracing energy efficiency at scale and create research and programs and policies that help drive deeper investment in the built environment. We focus on buildings because they are the #1 user of energy in the U.S., and particularly in cities. Buildings represent the majority of energy consumption in almost all cities that we work in. And the building sector, as you know, is kind of ripe with opportunity to reap energy savings. We work trying to promote a strategy of market transformation, which is the process of strategic market intervention, aiming to remove barriers and leverage opportunities to internalize the value of energy efficiency as a matter of standard business practice in the real estate industry. Our goal, like you could say, is to create a self-sustaining energy efficiency market, and we do that by advising state and local governments, federal agencies, and industry groups, also engaging with real estate markets to integrate energy efficiency considerations into business practices. One of the areas in which we've been very active is in benchmarking and transparency policy. Essentially, one of the major problems in the energy efficiency world is that energy efficiency itself of a building is not visible to the marketplace. Although energy performance obviously is a valuable attribute of a building, it's not that easy to look at a building and tell if it's energy efficient. So that's where benchmarking and transparency policy comes into play. Essentially, a benchmarking and transparency policy requires building owners to use Energy Star Portfolio Manager software from the EPA to calculate metrics on their building's energy performance and then report that information to the jurisdiction, and in turn the jurisdiction makes a subset of that energy performance information available to the marketplace. So as you see in the slide, it's kind of like putting an energy label on buildings, although that's not literally the way that most policies work. This slide just quickly shows the elements of benchmarking policy. So the three major components of actually benchmarking the energy use, measuring that energy consumption, and the building owner obviously is kind of the prime audience for that. Then there's reporting that information to the jurisdiction. So policymakers and others like utility program administrators are sometimes able to access that information. And then there's the transparency component, which is making that energy performance data available to the marketplace so that buyers and tenants can evaluate a building's energy performance before making a decision on where to invest. The idea is that when you measure the performance, it improves, and when you report that performance to the marketplace, it'll accelerate the rate of improvement as there's more kind of the market is able to value energy efficient buildings, and there's more pressure to have a building that works and operates efficiently. Before we go on to our presenters, just quickly, wanted to show you this slide, which shows the benchmarking policies that are in effect, or at least have been adopted in the United States so far. We have, as you can see, many cities have passed benchmarking ordinances in the past about 7 or 8 years, including 2 states, California and Washington. The light blue states have benchmarking for their public buildings. The orange represents benchmarking policies that cover privately owned commercial buildings and multifamily buildings. And then the kind of light green color represents policies that cover public and commercial buildings, but not multifamily. Just to give you a sense of the growth and I guess the popularity of these policies, this chart here shows you that in 2008, when the first benchmarking policy was adopted, you can see the cumulative floor area covered there is less than 1 billion square feet, whereas in a relatively short time we're over 10 billion square feet covered as of 2016. The green lines there represent estimates of carbon savings, high and low, that theoretically should follow if the benchmarking policies do sort of help the marketplace realize the value of energy efficiency and drive building owners and to invest in efficiency. So that's a very brief overview of benchmarking policies, and LB&L will give you some more information on kind of how they're constructed. But as you can see, benchmarking is a growing policy choice that jurisdictions are making as they're looking at energy efficiency and their local private and public building stock. And the research that you'll hear about today is very exciting because it's some early indicators of what these policies are doing in the marketplace. So that said, I'm going to turn over control to Natalie Mims of Lawrence Berkeley National Labs to present on their latest report. Okay, Natalie, you should be good to go.
All right. I'm not certain where my advanced slide button is. I apologize. But it might be easier if you just advance them for me, if that's okay, Zach.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, everybody. My name's Natalie Mims. I'm with Berkeley Lab, and today my colleague Steve Schiller and I are going to be talking about our new report from Berkeley Lab, and you can see the link to it on this slide as well as a picture of the publication. And we have several slides, but we have 3 presenters on our webinar today, so we're going to move through our slides at a pretty fast pace, and we're hoping to expose you to some of the content in our report and pique your interest and maybe get you to ask some questions during the last portion of our webinar. So just quickly on this slide, the report purpose, as Andrew mentioned, it was congressionally mandated, the study was, and the focus of the report was on 24 jurisdictions as of the end of 2016 that required privately owned commercial buildings to participate in a benchmarking and transparency program. So if you go on to the next slide, the report components are what is going to pop up there, and there's 3 main components to the report. The first one summarizes benchmarking and transparency policy design and implementation characteristics. You can see the list there, some of the ones: data requirements, compliance, education and outreach, use of compliance help centers, etc. The second report component was summarizing the enabling role of benchmarking and transparency policies and how effects are evaluated and determined, with some initial indications of the identified impacts. And the effects that we measured, an example for impacts would be energy use intensity, and an example for indicators would be job growth, and an example of a milestone would be if a city achieved a certain percentage of compliance within the building stock that they were targeting, so 90% compliance by buildings that were required. So that's kind of a rundown on the effects. And then our third report component, we identified some best practices in benchmarking and transparency policy design, implementation, and research. And if we go on to the next slide, it will be about the approach. So the approach that we used was we interviewed staff from 13 different jurisdictions that have been implementing benchmarking and transparency policies for at least 3 years, and you can see the list there. And we reviewed jurisdiction benchmarking and transparency ordinances, and we looked at recent research, including work from our other 2 presenters at NEMA and MIT, other third-party reports from Resources for the Future and IMT, DOE, EPA Portfolio Manager, and then we also looked at the annual reports and data from different jurisdictions that compiled the information. If we go on to the next slide, I think I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk about the impacts, or the performance metrics, excuse me, from our report.
Great. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to Zach and Andrew for getting us started. And I particularly want to thank IMT for sponsoring the webinar and their work in this field over many years, as well as Department of Energy for sponsoring the work, the report that Natalie and I were presenting today under Andrew's guidance. And also, I want to do a shout out to the many people in our audience who are the ones implementing these programs. As our team was reviewing your work, we were all very impressed with the efforts that you're doing. So because we have a limited time to present this, as Natalie indicated, while we have time, I'm going to go pretty quickly through the next 6 slides here. Starting with this slide, I just want to introduce the 3 types of metrics that we investigated and discussed in the report. The first is energy impacts. This, of course, is a category most people think about. It's the bottom line, how much energy and energy costs have been reduced as a result of the B&T policy. But as most of you know, another driver for many of these B&T policies are non-energy impacts that can accrue to utilities or the participants or perhaps society as a whole. These might be the environmental benefits or more jobs or simply better understanding of the building performance. And then the last category is market transformation and market adoption metrics. I'm going to focus on market transformation metrics for the next slide or 2 because these metrics are both quite important to the success of B&T policies, and also the ones that, while appreciated by most designers and implementers of these policies, are not usually tracked. So next slide, please. So market transformation metrics, kind of a mouthful, are important because of the logic behind how benchmarking and transparency policies support lower building energy use and cost, as well as the non-energy impacts I mentioned from the last slide. These B&T policies are enabling strategies. They rely on market transformation to reach their goals. In and of themselves, the B&T policies do not save energy. What they do is address the barriers to achieving these, and it's shown on this curve here, which is a very standard progression by which markets are transformed. Just tracking energy impacts, for example, not the progression along this market transformation curve, that is tracking the milestones that occur, can give a pretty incomplete picture. So it's important to track these milestones and show how the policy is working and how the policies can be improved to increase the likelihood of these ultimate goals. So next slide, please. So with a bit of that background, for our study, Berkeley Lab did not do any original evaluation work. What we did was review the work done by others to date with respect to these three categories of metrics and the tracking that they've done on specific building data. What we found is that jurisdictions are tracking energy consumption and building characteristics such as square footage, but less than half so far are actually tracking the energy impacts. And let me remind you, by the way, the consumption is different than impacts or savings. Consumption simply indicates how much is being used at any point in time, but not how much is being saved. Consumption alone, which pretty much everybody tracks, unfortunately doesn't give a full picture. And as I tried to indicate with the last two slides, even though market transformation is critical to the success of these policies, with pretty much just the exception of the New York NEMA study that you'll be hearing about shortly, there really is no systematic tracking of these market transformation characteristics or metrics, even though many of the people we spoke to did express interest in tracking them. And so this is one of the things that Natalie will talk about we'd like to encourage going forward. Next slide. So this slide, next one from a report, summarizes what metrics have been reported by jurisdictions. I'm not going to go through these, but to reinforce my last point about what is reported, as the table shows, only 6 of the cities, and actually none of the states with B&T policies, have themselves calculated and publicly reported either energy or non-energy impacts. In addition to these 6 self-reporting cities, there was a 4-city analysis of net energy cost impacts that covered Austin, New York City, San Francisco, and Seattle. And then there's also 2 third-party studies of the impacts of the New York City ordinance, and we'll be hearing about one of those up soon. So in total, some form of energy impact data has been reported for 8 cities. Next slide, please. I think next slide. There we go. Okay, so sort of in conclusion, that was a 2-page table. So in conclusion, what I tried to do is summarize these energy impacts, but understand that determining energy impacts tries to address 2 primary issues that come up. One, are buildings subject to these B&T policies actually consuming less energy? And then 2, can any of the observed changes in energy use be attributed to the B&T policy? So we have some results on the first question and a bit on the second one. However, I do want to mention these should probably be considered preliminary from what we reviewed. As a bottom line, most B&T policy impacts found there is reductions in energy use, either energy use or cost or intensity, with on the order of 3 to 8% reductions in gross energy consumption or intensity over the period of their analysis. And then 2 studies to date, again, one that'll be covered on this webinar, indicate that there is a cause and effect relationship between the B&T policies and energy savings, or at least the energy cost savings. And with that quick overview of the metrics, let me turn it back to Natalie. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Steve. So I'm going to wrap up the lab's presentation by talking about some of our recommendations and providing you with a few example recommendations. So if we go on to the next slide, our report included recommendations on B&T policy design and implementation, access to data, and performance metrics. And I want to talk about 2 different groups of recommendations. The first one is data and data analysis. We had 2 big recommendations around this, collecting comprehensive data On subject buildings with a focus on consistent definitions and quality control checks and verification, we found that this was somewhat important, and the example provided here is square footage. When we were talking to jurisdictions, there's a lot of different ways to define square footage, whether it's usable space or the entire building or the square footage from a parcel, tax ID, or other source. It's important to make sure there's consistent use of these definitions, and that was one of our recommendations. Our second recommendation around data and data analysis was to provide publicly available data in a user-friendly way that can be used for both high-level metrics and also more granular assessments. And we found that in reviewing data, that several jurisdictions have data available on websites in Excel format, and it is pretty easy to access, but it's very challenging to see if the same building is participating in the benchmarking program over time, and it makes it challenging to be able to assess whether or not the energy impacts from one building are continuing to decline over time, or if it's just the buildings in aggregate are declining or increasing over time. So that was another recommendation that we had. We go on to the next slide. I have recommendations, for some example recommendations around implementation. And the two on this slide are to provide annual reports with summary statistics of data, performance metrics, and identified areas of opportunities for improvements within each jurisdiction. And a lot of the jurisdictions are doing this, but not all the reports are being done annually. So that was one of our recommendations. And then to provide a range of support services and complementary policies at the local level. And we have a pretty big list there, online resources and how-to guides, webinars, in-person trainings, help centers, particularly with the use of volunteers, additional support during designated periods in the B&T policy implementation, right at the beginning when people are confused, and then also at the time when compliance reports or compliance data are due. And then finally, considering the creation of a national or regional help desk to encourage data consistency and reduce implementation costs. And if we go on to our next slide, it's my last example recommendation on implementation, which is to support high levels of compliance by measuring compliance every year by building type, and also collecting data on barriers to compliance and then developing strategies to overcome those barriers. And then if we flip through, this is just a quick advertisement for technical assistance. The lab does technical assistance on a variety of different topics. So if you're interested in that, if you go to the next slide, it has Steve and I's contact information. We're more than happy to talk to you about that. And if you have any questions, we will be on the line at the end of the call. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks, Natalie and Stephen. David?
Hi. Zach, can you give me control of the mouse?
I just did. So,
great.
Okay.
I will do my best, and if it doesn't work, then I'll ask you guys to advance the slides if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So I just want to start by saying this is a project we've been working on for a while, actually. It's kind of very heartening to see how much work has been done in benchmarking. We've been working on it for probably 5 or 6 years now, and my group, Ting Meng, has gone on to become a professor at China Agricultural University in Beijing. We started working at UPenn together. I'm actually at MIT now. I started working on this at UPenn, and another one of my doctoral students, Albert Han, has gone on to the University of Alberta. But this has been a project we've been working on together for almost 3 years now. And if you don't mind advancing the slide, Zach, sorry. So the reason why we worked on this project, I just want to give you a little bit of background story. I'm going to race through, hopefully not too much, but the slides are rather text heavy because we really wanted to use this project to really prove the question of how much energy has been saved by benchmarking. And this question is really important to us because we think it's really important as we advocate for new laws. The growth in benchmarking cities has been fairly incredible, but I think it's always a testament to IMT and DOE's efforts, how many more cities are interested in passing these laws. So we want to understand how much energy we're saving to advocate for new laws in new places. We want to understand the impact of the existing laws. And fundamentally, as researchers, we want to understand how much impact has this had so we can hopefully improve policies going forward, both in new and existing cities. If you could advance it further, please. But this is also a really difficult question. And actually, I have to give credit where credit's due. Not only have all the IMT staff been working on this for many years, I presented some preliminary research results last year at ACEEE, but I think the research has improved over the last year as we've gone through peer review and it's become a peer-reviewed published article. Andrew Burr actually first kind of raised this question to me a number of years ago, I think in 2014 or so. He was saying that a lot of cities were asking how much energy we're going to save. And Cody Taylor and I talked about it quite a bit, and he suggested a number of ways to also attack the problem. But the reason why it's a difficult problem is because there's lots of different ways that benchmarking could save energy. It could be first because of preparation. It could be that owners are becoming more aware of their energy use. Is it, what's the mechanism for disclosure? Is it because of market pressure or public pressure? Is it really from tenants, or is it from owners feeling pressure themselves? Or is it because people are actively in the market? A number of the cities I've worked with, like New York, Seattle, and Philadelphia, all have slightly different benchmarking policies that really respond to different, actually disclose information in different ways. And of course, one question we've always had all along is the rating of the buildings themselves, or how you rate the buildings, important? Is it the effect of raw data in the market, or is it the Energy Star scores themselves? Next, please. But the reason why it's a difficult question is because of causality, which is really kind of important to us as academic researchers. In order to explain things, we feel like we need a control group. But the problem is almost all the benchmarking and transparency policies have been implemented in a whole city, which means that every city is fairly different. So it's really hard to find a control group that wasn't affected by this policy. In other words, what's the counterfactual? And to give you an example, Margaret Walls and Karen Palmer from Resources for the Future back in 2014 also helped stimulate some of our thinking on this question, because they said, well, there's a possibility of self-selection effects. So to give you an example, next slide, please. They look at the EPA data trends, and EPA has said before that they presented this report in Data Trends in 2012. There's energy savings in Portfolio Manager, and you have to understand energy savings in Portfolio Manager is really different than energy savings due to Portfolio Manager. They're basically showing us that energy use of the buildings in Portfolio Manager have decreased 7% over these 3 or 4 years. And they also show us that Energy Star scores have increased by 6 points over these 3 or 4 years. But of course, we could tell lots of different counterfactual stories about why this might be true. It could be that the population of energy buildings in Portfolio Manager has changed over time. It could be we could tell a story about a Great Recession happening from 2008 to 2011. Maybe that's why energy use has gone down. So Walls and Palmer, I think, rightfully actually question this as a result. Next slide, please. And I think they really draw a question, is this trend real? Are these numbers real? If you can't account for self-selection, then you really can't say that the savings are due to benchmarking and transparency yet, which is why we tackled the question in a different way. Next slide, please. So we want to really establish a rigorous causal estimate for energy savings. We want to find a control group. And the way we did this is to use the fact that a lot of cities, in New York in particular, staged their policy implementation. And by staging their policy implementation, they treated different groups of buildings at different times. We can use that as kind of a natural experiment and compare these buildings at all these different stages to see how much energy consumption drops among similar groups of buildings at every stage of policy implementation. The important thing I want to emphasize is that actually this can be used in almost all the cities that have implemented benchmarking and transparency up till now, because almost all of them followed stage policy implementation under the recommendation of groups like IMT and DOE. Next, please. So I'll just say that we use the difference in difference method. It's a econometric or statistical method that allows us to calculate the average treatment effect. I'll actually show you some of these bullet points, so I'll just go ahead quickly. Next slide, please. So the key visualization is this 2x2 matrix. And the important thing is it's just this 2x2 matrix where we have this 0 and 1, 0 and 0. And all that means is that you had a treatment group that you could observe before and after the policy. You have a control group that you can observe before and after the policy. The crucial difference is that the treatment group at first is not subject to the policy, and then it is subject to the policy. So the strong assumption here is that if the policy had been implemented, the treatment group would look like the control group. Next slide, please. So the really key things you want to look at are the groups that have the kind of blue control zeros, or they actually could be a constant control like a policy. and the treatment group, which is this one, and then you get this econometric specification at the bottom. Next slide, please. So the key policy, staged policy implementation, which I think applies to many of the cities that have implemented this law, is that in New York, in 2009, they passed the law. They started benchmarking public buildings. Next. And the important thing is in 2009, they gathered the information, but they did not disclose the public building data, which means that you can really start to discriminate what the effect of these buildings gathering the data is, but they're not actually necessarily subject to public pressure yet at this point. Next, please. In 2011 is the first time they disclosed the public building data, and then they actually gather but do not disclose the commercial building data. Next, please. In 2012 is the first time they disclosed commercial building data. Next, please. And then they actually continued gathering and disclosing commercial data. And then 2013, 2014, they continue to gather and disclose building data. So you can see as this policy, parts of the policy roll in year after year, we always have a control group, always a treatment group in these years where you can see if they've been treated differently, which is public buildings versus private buildings and so on. Next, please. And this is to give credit to Cody Taylor. Cody Taylor really suggested a number of ways to think about mechanisms by which this disclosure policy might work. It could be the preparation of energy information, this first box labeled N. It could be disclosing the energy information, labeled I. It could be disclosing Energy Star scores, labeled S. This all affects building owners, the market, and potential tenants and buyers, and this hopefully affects building energy use at the end. Next, please. So just to give you a sense of how we identify these treatment control groups, we had this 4 years of panel data. We actually identified 261 commercial office buildings. The key thing about these buildings is that they're first privately benchmarked, and then they publicly disclose both their energy data and their Energy Star data. Next, please. Our first control group was actually a group of 75 public or city office buildings. And if you talk to New York City staff, they'll tell you that actually the New York City buildings are managed quite similarly to private buildings, and they're actually often bought and sold into the public portfolio. So in a lot of ways, these are mostly Class B office buildings, but they're pretty similar to the private buildings we looked at. And we did a lot of statistical tests to make sure that we thought they were similar enough to compare. Next, please. And we looked at a second control group, which is 39 other commercial buildings, which for various reasons reported energy data, but didn't have Energy Star scores. Next, please. So you can play with all these different effects and these treatment control groups. You get all these effects. You kind of take your statistical equation, apply it to the data, and you can kind of distinguish these little effects from the control and treatment groups because certain policies only apply at certain times to different groups. And I'll show you the results in a second. Next slide, please. Just to highlight what these statistical results mean, I'm sorry, I think they got squeezed a little bit at the bottom. The statistical results, these are kind of standard social science results where you have a coefficient. This is actually modeling the log energy use intensity of the buildings. You have a standard error based on cluster errors. You have a p-value, and what I'll really just point out to you is the important lines are the red lines. The red lines are the ones where you have both disclosure and multiplied times a given year, which means that because you have these buildings measured over 4 years, you can start to see the changes in groups of buildings year over year. So what disclosure X 2012 means is that in the first year of commercial public disclosure of buildings, you actually don't get a statistically significant effect. That 0.02 basically means it looks like a 2% increase, but it's not statistically significant. The important thing is that disclosure in 2013, you actually have a 6% decrease, which is 3 years after the policy is implemented, and that's weakly significant. And disclosure X 2014 means that you actually have a 14% decrease in EUI in the 4th year of the policy, and that's actually strongly significant. That's for the results of energy data and Energy Star scores. Next slide, please. And if you look at the next slide, you actually look at the results just for Energy Star scores. Because we have 2 different control groups, we can't necessarily distinguish the effects of raw energy data and Energy Star scores. We can only do this based on the stage policy implementation. But again, you see the results seem to be roughly the same, which means that in the 3rd year of the policy, which is Energy Star scores, and in 2013, you have about a 9% decrease in energy use, and Energy Star scores in 2014, you have about a 13% decrease in energy use. And so all the results seem to indicate in the 3rd year of benchmarking and transparency, some combination of energy data and Energy Star scores give you about a 9% decrease in the third year and about a 13 to 14% decrease in the fourth year. Next slide, please. I've been speaking fairly quickly, but I want to emphasize that this method of analysis is actually important for two reasons. You can replicate this in most of the cities that are already doing benchmarking because they sequentially introduce their policies. Next, please. Next, please. Sorry. These just summarize what I just said. Next, please. And the important thing I really want you to take home from this kind of talk, if this is, and you please feel free to ask questions about. So this is a quasi-experimental research design, which means we observed the data, but we actually looked in it for experimental settings within the data. We did find statistically significant results. The results are fairly consistent between two different control groups, and this possibly points to the different effectiveness of different data sources and communication. Last slide, please. The important thing is we want to actually repeat this in other cities. And finally, because this is based on panel data, we can actually use this every year to measure whether or not the savings are persistent, and also if the savings are changing over time, and hopefully it gives us a way to kind of fine-tune our policies. Last slide, please. And the important thing is that I've been speaking fairly quickly. It's shorthand for this published paper that just came out a few months ago. It's available at this web link, and you're free to download the slides, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Okay.
Great. So this is Patrick Hughes. I'm with the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. And I do have control of the slides. That's great. So for those of you who may not be familiar with my organization, we are a trade association representing the manufacturers of equipment like lighting systems and the motors that would go into HVAC systems, sub-meters, basically the electrical equipment that goes into making buildings more energy efficient. So we've been working for a few years on benchmarking, promoting these policies and their adoption in cities. And 2 years ago or so, we asked ourselves the question, how are these policies working? And specifically, what upgrades are building owners and facility managers making in their facilities as a result of the benchmarking policies that are getting passed? So we conducted a survey of 151 facility managers in New York. We chose New York because it had its policy implemented the longest. And our sample included 70% of the respondents had commercial buildings, half had some residential buildings, and 13% had some city-owned buildings. We have a full breakdown of other types of demographics and ownership structures from the facility managers because some of them owned more than one building, as these percentages would indicate. Importantly, we wanted to get decision makers in our sample. So almost 70% of the facility managers we surveyed have decision-making authority in terms of upgrades to make in their buildings. Only 1% were minimal decision makers. So the way we structured our survey was we asked people if they were in compliance with Local Law 84. Most said they were, and these numbers are similar to what the city is reporting, especially when you take into account that 14% where some of the facilities are in compliance and some are not. And then we asked a series of questions to both the group that was in compliance with Local Law 84 and the group that was not in compliance with Local Law 84. And we structured them in two sections. First, I'll talk about the capital expenditures that they made, and second, I'll talk about some of the low or no cost operational changes that they made to make their buildings operate more efficiently. So the first question we asked was, have you made an investment in energy efficient equipment to improve the performance, energy performance of your building? 82% of the compliant facilities said that yes, they had made an investment to improve their energy efficiency. And you can contrast that with the 75% of those who reported as non-compliant with the benchmarking policy that made some investment. So then we asked them specifically, what did you do? What capital expenditures did you make as a result of Local Law 84, which is the benchmarking policy in New York? Most people said that they made a lighting upgrade, and that includes the actual light bulbs, fixtures. Then the next most popular was heating upgrades to the actual heating system in the building, separate from the controls. 55% made an investment in lighting controls, so that could include daylight management, where the lights automatically dim in response to the amount of natural light available. Could be dimmers, could be occupancy and vacancy sensors, anything other than just a regular light switch, on-off light switch. Building energy management system, a little bit over half of the compliant facilities said they invested in a energy management system. A little bit less than that invested something in their cooling system. And then we see a big drop off in some of the more involved upgrades to buildings. So plug load management being automated receptacles in the building that could manage plug loads like appliances or computers, for example. Daylighting, this would be actual envelope improvements to bring more natural light into the building. And then building envelope too, obviously this one is disruptive to tenants, a little bit more expensive. So naturally we would see fewer of the facility managers making those types of improvements to upgrade the efficiency of their facilities. Cost savings, perhaps unsurprisingly, were the #1 reported reason for why these facility managers were choosing to invest. A significant amount said they also wanted to help the environment. And then, after that, we have following best practices. The results of the benchmarking demonstrated some opportunity to improve the performance of their facility. And then just under a third said that the building owner told them to make some change. And about a quarter said to receive recognition or certification. This would most likely be Energy Star certification for the facility. And we then asked those who did not make an investment in their facility why they chose not to. 50% said that no change was needed. 40% or so said that the owner did not approve the expenditure. So to me, those two things indicate, one, that there's probably some education that needs to happen because I doubt that 50% of those buildings truly did not need a change. And then talking to the owners too about payback of some of these energy efficiency upgrades, making sure that they can see that in fact these aren't necessarily too expensive and they should be approved. So the second series of questions focused on those low and no cost operational changes or commissioning improvements to the facility. 84% of the facility managers that were in compliance with Local Law 84 said they made an operational change, and you can contrast that with just 67% of the non-compliant facilities. Then we asked them, what specifically did you do? We got a range of answers, from training building staff to making sure that the heating and the cooling systems don't run at the same time, which seems obvious, but that was a very popular operational change to make in the building. And then calibrating their systems, the building automation system, the variable air volume box flow, chiller staging. And we also see working with building occupants there in the middle, just over half, gave some sort of training to the tenants in the facility on how to operate the building more efficiently. Again, we asked, what motivated you to make these changes, and cost savings. Again, the far and away biggest driver here. We asked those who did not make an operational change, why? And again, we see no change needed, too costly, and don't know what changes to make. So again, I think there's an opportunity here to do more education about the type of energy efficiency upgrades, both capital expenditures and the operational changes in these facilities. Finally, in the survey, we asked an open-ended question just to get additional input. Of the responses, about half were positive in nature, and only 8% were neutral, or I'm sorry, 8% were negative, and then the remainder were neutral. So I chose a few of my favorites and a few illustrative examples to give you a sense of what they were like. Obviously, we were motivated to make changes, is what the policymakers that are enacting these benchmarking policies are hoping to achieve. Always interested in hearing about, sorry, just had a pop up here. There we go. Always interested in hearing about and implementing more cost-effective, energy-efficient programs that result in cost savings. So good, they're open to hearing more information. We've installed thermostats and changed light bulbs to more efficient models and have seen a significant reduction in electricity usage. This person said that the energy efficient lighting upgrades in the common areas were not well received by tenants. So certainly shows that you need to make the correct improvements to the building. This person thought that Local Law 84 was a waste of time. There were a mix of positive and negative comments here. Added work, but proved informative. And then my favorite of all of them was submitted in all caps, I just like Save on Energy. So I'd encourage you to download the report. It's on our website at nema.org/HPB. And feel free to reach out with any questions either in the Q&A session now or after this webinar.
Thank you, Patrick. So we still have about 8 minutes left to do question and answer. I want to say thanks to all 4 of our panelists for packing a lot of information into a very short time. So thank you all and great job. So the way we've got quite a number of questions and we won't be able to get to them all. One of the first questions we got was, will the slides be available? And the answer to that is yes, they will. We will make a recording of the webinar available and send the slides out. So the next question we have is from Steve Rosenstock, and this is for Natalie and Steve. And the question is, are the 3 to 8% reductions that you found, are they normalized for weather or changes in building occupancy?
Hi, this is Steve. I'll try a first cut at that. And I think the answer is yes, they are. I have to go back and look at the results. Some cities did correct for weather. I think most of them did, but I don't think that was always the case. And I think that's part of why we might see a range there. We have to go back and look within the report itself. It does indicate which cities corrected for weather. That was a primary thing that was corrected for versus other possible variables such as energy rates or changes in square footages and such. So it's a definitive, it depends answer on that one.
Thanks, Steve. And we've got one more question for you and Natalie. And that question is, do the implementation recommendations have a cost and payback section where each recommendation has details on how much it costs and the ROI, the return on investment. I guess in essence.
I don't know if Natalie wants to that
No,
go ahead, Natalie.
We do not have that level of detail in the report. Unfortunately, that was well outside of the scope of what we were able to do, but it certainly would be interesting.
Okay. So David Sue, we have a question for you. This is from Steve Rosenstock. The question is, for 2014, was the data normalized for weather and or changes in building occupancy function? Also, did it show 23% reduction in natural gas and 60% plus reduction in fuel oil use?
So Steve, great question. The way that we did this in this report was that the assumption is that the treatment and control groups both respond to the weather similarly. Energy Star scores themselves include weather normalized data, but the assumption is that all the weather across New York City, across these treatment and control group buildings would be the same. So that actually does not show up as a variable, because the assumption is that if the energy goes down in the control set of buildings, it would have gone down in the treatment set of buildings also. So when we get the treatment effects, the assumption is that all the things that we controlled for in our study are different between the treatment and control groups. But that's and then the second part of the question, it's not a 23% reduction in natural gas and 60% reduction in fuel oil use. It's actually, those are included as control variables because we did a lot of tests to see if our treatment and control groups were similar. What we found is that between the treatment and control groups, natural gas and fuel oil use is slightly different, but actually all those things are statistically significant enough that we can actually account for them in the differences between treatment and control group, and therefore predict the treatment effects accurately.
Thanks. Thank you, David. Patrick, a question for you. This is from Marshall Dewar-Balkand. Are non-compliant facilities subject to the law but not compliant, or are they just not covered by local law 84?
So we had a series of screening questions at the beginning to rule out facility managers that would not be subject to the law. We asked, for example, facility size, facility type, things like that. So the people who were reporting to be non-compliant are subject to local law 84, and so they should be reporting if they answered those screening questions honestly. And I should say, I'll follow that up with just one quick thing. If they reported that they were not compliant, in the survey we explained what local law 84 was, and then we asked a follow-up question, are you planning on complying with local law 84? And 75% of those respondents said that yes, they are planning on complying with local law 84 eventually.
Thanks, Patrick. Next question we have is for David, and this is also from Marshall Dewar-Balkand. The question is, could the same methodology be applied to staggered compliance? So buildings that complied late for multiple years versus complied on time. Does that make sense, David, the question?
That's a great question, Marshall. Yes, you could apply it. The one thing you might run into is if you might have extremely small sample sizes in those groups. But Marshall, you know I'm always happy to talk over the data, so we can try to follow up on that if you'd like.
Okay, we have time for probably 2 more questions here. Patrick, did the survey ask if the building owners used energy efficiency programs or incentives to make those investments?
No, we didn't ask that question.
Okay. Let's see. One more question here. This will be for Natalie and Steve. The question is, how do cities handle data verification? Could you just kind of briefly summarize any patterns you saw there?
Natalie, do you have any, I can probably respond some general comments on that. Natalie, do you recall any specifics from our survey work?
Let's see, off the top of my head, I know that there were some specific examples, but I'm not recalling them right at this moment. I know there was a pretty broad range of how cities were verifying data, but I could definitely follow up with whoever that is with a better response.
I think in our report we pull out an example, and I want to say Seattle, that, but I could be wrong about that, that had a specific verification regimen. But like Natalie, I don't remember the specifics. It was quite a range where there was, I think in some cases, like in that example of Seattle or perhaps Chicago, New York, that had a protocol. Others took what came in. And verification is one of the issues that we have noted that, among other things, definitions that people use. For example, something as straightforward as square footage. Someone might use data from their permits or from an appraisal or the memory of the building manager, whether it's square footage that is occupied square footage, which could be different than total square footage. And so there can be variance not only in verifying what's submitted, but that it's consistent within the database by the definitions used by different buildings.
And I will just add to that IMT keeps a website called buildingrating.org, where we track information about all the different benchmarking and transparency policies that have been adopted. So we have descriptions of the data verification requirements of all these policies on buildingrating.org, which is a pretty good resource for people who have questions about kind of policy and programmatic design for these benchmarking ordinances. But with that, we are all out of time, so I want to just say thanks again to our panelists from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, MIT, and NEMA for doing such great presentations. We will have the slides and recording of the webinar available. So apologize we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. What we can do is kind of send these to the panelists so that they can respond to them on their own time. And if you have any additional questions, of course, feel free to ask me, Zach Hart at IMT, and we can kind of help you get some answers. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.